Hey guys, it's going Dudey, and I'm back with another video. In today's video, we're going to be talking about Des Nilsen. Now, you may well have heard that name before. He is quite a prolific and infamous serial killer. We're going to be going through the case and the murders today. You may also have noticed that on Netflix right now, there is a documentary about this case. It kind of goes into all of his memoirs and his tapes. It's very interesting. I've watched it myself. It's very good. I will talk about it a little bit at the end of this video. But first, let's jump straight into the case of Des Nilsen. This case is very different. Normally, when you have a murder case, when you have a killer, you will have victims and then there will be a hunt for the killer. Well, this case is kind of backwards. Although they did initially start with some remains, the killer gave himself up instantaneously and basically wouldn't shut up and almost gloated. So what happened was Dynarod, which is a company that is essentially like they fix drains. Yeah, if your drain is blocked, they'll come along and they'll unblock it for you. Dynarod received a call out to 23 Cranley Gardens because there was a blockage in the drainage system. So the guy came out and he found the cause of the issue, and it seemed to be, from a non-professional observation, human remains, bones, flesh, rotting, filling up and blocking the drainage system. So naturally, he called the police, and the police got there and they confirmed that yes, these are indeed human remains. And the drainage guy deduced that this was coming from the top floor flat, which belonged to Des Nilsen. So they cordoned it off, they're doing their investigation, and Des Nilsen just happens to calmly walk home from work. And as he does so, the police are obviously there, and they're like, right, you, what's going on here? And Des actually says that he's a bit confused, that police want to know why his drains are blocked. But they take him up into his flat, and instantaneously the odour of rotting corpses, flesh, death hits the police officers, and one of the inspectors says to Des, right, cut the shit, where is the rest of the body? Because clearly it's just kind of smaller parts of the body that's been flushed down the toilet. So Des points to a wardrobe, and there they discover two heaving sacks full of remains. So they arrest him, and as they're driving to the police station, the police officer asks him, he says, you know, those bags are very full. Are we just talking about one body here, or is there two? Nilsen turns around and says 15 or 16. At which point, the inspector instantly realises the gravity of the situation, that he has a serial killer on his hands. So the police have 48 hours to question this man and get as much information, get a confession out of him, so that they can take him to court and have him sent down for the murder of all of these victims. Now, this is obviously often when criminals shut up. They don't say anything, they give the police nothing, so the police run out of time, and it just makes the police's job a hell of a lot harder getting that conviction. Well, Des Nilsen did not shut up. You couldn't stop him from talking. He was so open and honest about all of the murders that took place, almost like he was actually proud of being so open and honest. And he actually said in the Des Nilsen tapes, he said how proud he was of himself on just how forthright he was on confronting his offending behaviour. He kind of felt like, you know, normally in this kind of circumstances, the killers don't really give up all that much. But look at him being an outstanding citizen, giving his whole story. But the thing is, this was probably just because he knew the level of attention that was going to be on him. One thing that startled the police was how on earth 15 or 16 victims could go missing over a 4-year period and no one know about it. Well, the fact was that Nilsen's demographic tended to be homeless, vulnerable young men and boys, often homosexual. And in that time period of, you know, the late 70s, early 80s, society was incredibly homophobic. The police were incredibly homophobic. Media was incredibly homophobic. And to be honest, if there was ever anything reported, it was often just either swept under the carpet or shunned to the side because of homophobia. Nilsen almost saw an opportunity to have a target demographic where no one would essentially give a shit. As you can imagine, the media quickly got hold of this story and sensationalized it and blew it up beyond comprehension. This guy was a serial killer. He was open to telling everyone what he was doing. He was killing gay men. That is a factor that the media really fixated on, the fact that he was killing gay men, and this actually led to almost disruptions in the case because not all of the victims were homosexual men, but because it was portrayed in that manner, a lot of people didn't want to come forward, didn't want to give evidence because they didn't want to be humiliated or portrayed in a false light or scrutinized either because they were or they weren't homosexual. So as I said, he began really opening up about the murders. So I feel like now is a good place in this video to talk about those murders in chronological order. So initially, these murders took place at 195 Melrose Avenue. So Nilsen killed his first victim, who was a 14-year-old boy called Stephen Holmes, on the 30th December 1978. Nilsen found Stephen in a pub where Stephen was failing to be served alcohol because he was only 14 years old. Now, Nilsen had apparently been drinking heavily that day by himself until he got himself to such an emotional state that he felt like he had to go out and get company at any cost. So he left his flat on 195 Melrose Avenue to go and seek out this company, and he found that in Stephen, in a 14-year-old boy in a pub in London. Nilsen invited Stephen back to his house, promising him alcohol and music. Nilsen apparently believed the boy to be 17 years old, got him heavily intoxicated, and they both fell asleep in Nilsen's bed. Now, the next morning, Nilsen woke up before Stephen did and found Stephen asleep next to him, and in his tapes claims that he didn't want to wake him up. He was afraid to wake Stephen up in case he left him and he would be alone again, seeking company once again. So Des made sure that Stephen never left him ever again. So he was caressing Stephen whilst he slept, and it was there that he apparently said that Stephen will be staying with him over New Year's, whether he wanted to or not. Dennis went on to strangle Stephen until he was unconscious and then drowned him in a bucket of water. He apparently washed Stephen's body in his bath, placed him down on his bed and masturbated over him. He then waited for rigor mortis to pass and then from there placed Stephen under his floorboards. His body remained there for around 8 months beneath the floorboards until Des decided to have a bonfire to get rid of the remains. Then on October the 11th, 1979, Nilsen attempted to murder again, this time student from Hong Kong, Andrew Ho. He met Andrew in a pub, St. Martin's Lane pub, and lured him back to his apartment with the promise of sex. Nilsen attempted to strangle him, however Ho managed to escape and went to the police. However, he decided later to not press charges. 2 months later, after that attempted murder, he came across Canadian student, 23-year-old Kenneth Ockenden. Again, Nilsen picked up this young man in a pub, this time in the West End. They both drank together, and upon learning that Ockenden was a student from Canada, there, almost like in a tourist capacity, said that he would show him some of the big places in London. And after he did that, he then offered to take him back to his flat. Ockenden accepted after the promise of alcohol, after the promise of food, after the promise of a place to sleep. Ockenden accepted after he was promised food and drink at Nilsen's place, kind of commonplace for Nilsen to offer his victims. And Nilsen offered Ockenden his music to listen to. He had his headphones on, and whilst Ockenden was listening to the music, Nilsen took the cord to the headphones, wrapped it around Ockenden's throat, and strangled him. He then poured himself a glass of rum and listened to music using the headphones attached to the cord that he just killed a man with. A day later, Des bought a Polaroid camera to take pictures of Ockendon's body. He posed him in all sorts of positions. He then laid Ockendon on his bed with him as he watched television for hours next to the corpse. He then wrapped the corpse up in plastic bags and placed him under the floorboards. From time to time over the following fortnight, Des would get the body out from underneath the floorboards and pose him in positions in his chair in the living room so that he had someone to watch television with. Fast forward to the 17th of May 1980, Nilsen's third victim, Martin Duffy, was a 16-year-old catering student who had hitchhiked to London from Merseyside without his parents' permission or awareness. For a couple of days, Duffy slept rough near Euston Station. Nilsen stumbled across the boy and offered him a place to stay and food to eat, which of course Duffy accepted. Once Duffy fell asleep, Nilsen leant on his chest and put a ligature around his throat and squeezed as hard as he could until Duffy became unconscious. It was from there he dragged him to the kitchen and drowned him in the sink. Nilsen then bathed with the boy's body, claiming he was the youngest looking he had ever seen. Very disturbing. Nilsen toyed with Duffy's body a lot, putting it in a kitchen chair, putting it in bed with him where he actually strangled him, kissing him, caressing him, doing all sorts with the body, although Nilsen does claim that he never once penetrated any of the corpses. Duffy was actually placed in the wardrobe for a couple of days until Nilsen realised that he was beginning to bloat, in which instance he straight away put him under the floorboards. Now, after the murder of Duffy, Nilsen really got a taste for murder and his spree increased dramatically. Before the end of 1980, bearing in mind he started with Duffy in May, by the end of 1980 he would have 5 further victims and attempt to murder another. However, Nilsen was always very forthright in, talking about his cases, talking about the murders that he committed. However, he rarely knew their names, he rarely could identify them very well. So of these 5 that he murdered additionally to Duffy, he could only actually identify 1, so 4 still to this day remain unidentified. Now, although he couldn't identify a lot of his victims, he still remembered vividly just how they were actually murdered. For example, Nilsen recounted how one of the unidentified victims would have his legs going in a cycling motion as he was strangling him. There was also another unidentified victim that he actually tried to resuscitate but failed to, and apparently cried and sobbed over the body because he actually wanted to bring him back to life. Another, he laid in bed with him and listened to classical music, crying alongside the young man that he just murdered. Now, obviously, storing bodies underneath your floorboards, you're going to come into a lot of problems, namely when they start to decay, when maggots start to appear, things like that. And this was definitely an issue for Nilsen, and he would often put down insecticide and air fresheners and all sorts to try and mask the smell, but of course it was getting to a point where it was impossible. Sometimes when Nilsen would move the bodies or want to, put them in his chair and watch TV and stuff, he would take note of how the bodies were decaying, saying often that maggots were coming from, the eyes and the mouth, and there would be like a pupae kind of liquid over the top as they would begin to break down. It was just very graphic and very grim information. Towards the tail end of 1980, he decided enough was enough and decided that it was time to burn the bodies. So he made a bonfire in his back garden. He cut up the bodies and he placed them on the bonfire. But what he did was he put a tyre on top of the bonfires because that would hopefully, the smell of burning rubber would hopefully mask the smell of burning flesh. Now, when he actually did this first bonfire, apparently 3 children were sort of like drawn to the fire and actually attended. And Nilsen said that he fantasized the children dancing around the bonfire in like a ritualistic kind of sending off to his victims. Once the bonfire was reduced to ash, he would then go through all the ashes looking if there was any easily identifiable bones, and once there was even actually a skull still intact. Now he would rake the remains in the ashes and then bury them. So when he saw this skull, he smashed the skull to pieces with his rake. In early 1981, he brought back another unidentified victim. This one, he promised a drinking game back at his house where he strangled him and killed him and placed him beneath the floorboards. And by April, Nilsen killed a further 2 unidentified people. So over the course of a year, being, early 1980 to early 1981, this guy had killed 7 or 8 people. Nilsen actually kind of reflected on, the fact that he was killing so many people, and he said the following: end of the day, end of the drink, end of a person. Floorboards back, carpet replaced, and back to work at Denmark Street. Just kind of how he saw his life. He'd go to work, come back, go get a drink, meet someone, bring him back, murder them, put them under the floorboards, replace the carpet, go back to work. It was like a really messed up, endless cycle for this guy. Nilsen would remove the internal organs because obviously they would decay quite quickly, and he would actually just discard them either in the wastage bins behind his flat and in his bins in his house. I can only imagine how bad that place smelled. Malcolm Barlow was the final victim at 23 Melrose Avenue. Now, the tragedy about Malcolm is he was actually slumped outside Nilsen's house because his medication for epilepsy caused his legs to weaken. Now, Nilsen brought him inside to call him an ambulance because he felt he needed to go to the hospital, which he did. He went to the hospital and the next day he was released. And so Malcolm went back to Nilsen's house to thank him for helping him. It was there he was invited in. They had some food. They had some alcohol. He fell asleep on the sofa, which is where Nilsen killed him by strangulating him as he slept. And he stored him under the sink in the kitchen. Nilsen was forced to vacate his property because his landlord wanted to renovate, and eventually, after some back and forth, was offered £1,000 to leave, which Nilsen begrudgingly accepted. But this left him with an issue. It meant he had to dispose of the bodies that were in his house. So he had one final bonfire at the location where he did his usual thing to dispose of the bodies. From here, he went to 23 Cranley Gardens, where of course eventually he would be caught. The issue with this place in comparison to the previous was that it had no garden, so it had nowhere for him to build a bonfire to discard of his bodies. So what he would do instead is he would cut them up and he would flush them down the toilet, which of course led to the drains being blocked. This also meant, because he was in an attic flat, he couldn't store them under the floorboards because, well, when a body starts to decay, it starts to kind of, in certain areas, melt down, if you like, into certain liquids, and that would probably come through the ceiling of the people living underneath him, which would then lead to him being arrested. So for a couple of months, everyone that came back to Nilsen's flat were actually not harmed in any way, apart from one individual, a 19-year-old boy who he attempted to strangle but actually stopped and restrained himself halfway through. Nilsen's next victim in March of 1982 actually fought back. He met him in a pub, he invited him back, they had drinks, they fell asleep, and Nilsen decided that it was time to kill again. Now, as he attacked John Howlett regained consciousness and began attacking Dennis back, trying to strangle him. Now, Dennis has said that he thought that he would be overpowered and actually killed himself. However, Nilsen actually managed to get the upper hand over Howlett using an upholstery strap and strangled him until he was knocked out. This apparently made Des shake with stress because he had never really experienced them fighting back before. He actually failed to kill Howlett 3 times after this because he just kept coming back around, kept breathing. So Dennis decided to fill up his bathtub and drown him, leading to the death of John Howlett. The next person that Des targeted survived, but Carl Stoter is very important in this case because Carl Stoter was the one who was brave enough to come forward and in the end had Des Nilsen's not guilty plea due to insanity thrown out and guilty given to him and his life sentence because Stoter was able to prove that Des was not insane and that everything was premeditated. So, of course, they met in a pub. Stoter was depressed because he just had a failed relationship. He goes back to Des's. They have food, they have drink, they go to sleep. Just before going to sleep, Des puts Stoter into a sleeping bag and says, be careful of the zip because you could choke on it because it's a bit of a funny zip. Now this was actually Des foreshadowing the way he was going to attempt to kill Stoter. Now Stoter then wakes up to Nilsen strangling him in the sleeping bag, and it does get a little bit confusing, but from my understanding Stoter was so confused that he believed in the moment that Nilsen was actually trying to free him and help him out of the sleeping bag before he fell into unconsciousness because he was being strangled, and it was from there that he felt cold water, and this was because inside the sleeping bag Nilsen was trying to drown him in the bathtub and did it successfully, but then Nilsen had second thoughts and resuscitated Stoter, and over the next 2 days was falling in and out of consciousness, but Nilsen convinced him that he had actually choked himself out on the zip of the sleeping bag, and Nilsen saved him by resuscitating him. Stoter, when he was back to full strength, said to Nilsen, hang on, like, what was going on there? I was being choked and then I remember cold water, blah, blah, blah. And Nilsen passed it off as he awoke from a nightmare, causing him to choke on the zip, and then Nilsen put him into cold water because he was in shock from choking on the zip. And from there, Nilsen took him to a train station and said, look, I hope we meet again and I wish you all the best. June 1982, he found another victim, Graham Allen. Now, Graham was not a homosexual man. He was just a heavily drunk man trying to hail a taxi, and no taxis would take him because of the state that he was in. Now, his partner in the Tapes documentary has since said that he was probably out trying to score some drugs because he did have a drug problem. Nilsen offered him food, alcohol, etc. back at his house. Nilsen took him back to his apartment. Nilsen strangled him and stored him in the bathtub for 3 days. Now, his partner was informed of exactly what happened to Graham. He was killed, he was stripped naked, he was bathed, covered in talcum powder, masturbated on, and then he was put into the armchair in his living room where he watched television with Des for as long as Des wanted someone around to keep him company. And that is a part in the documentary that was just really like, fucking hell. Like, imagine hearing that your partner or your loved one died that way and that this man kept parading the body around and defiling the body. It just really was awful, you know, to think of all the things that happened to these poor victims. And in January of 1983, Des killed his final victim, 20-year-old Stephen Sinclair. Stephen Sinclair came back to Nilsen's house and was given drugs and alcohol and fell asleep in the armchair. Now, apparently, Nilsen kneeled before Stephen and said the words, "Oh, Stephen, here I go again," and then choked him to death. Now, with Stephen's body, he did his normal ritual. He bathed the body, he covered it in talcum powder, he laid it on the bed, set up some mirrors around the bed so he could see all angles, laid with the body for many hours, and then turned Stephen's head towards himself, kissed him, caressed him, and wished him good night, and fell asleep next to the body. With all these bodies, they were cut up and stored in various places like the wardrobe or the tea chest within the house, and the smaller parts were flown flushed down the toilet. Now, on the 4th of February 1983, Dennis writes a letter to his landlord complaining about the fact that the drains are all blocked up, and as we circle right back round to the start of the video, this is when the police turn up because the diner rod guy finds human remains and he's arrested, etc, etc. So he goes to court, he pleads not guilty because of insanity, and so they need to prove that it's premeditation, and they talk to Stoter as one of the victims, and it all kind of comes back to him but in a new light, and he realises that actually Nilsen was trying to kill him, not help him, and of course remembers when he says about the sleeping bag and how you need to be careful because you might strangle yourself. And so that was enough to say this guy premeditated this, and it was a 10-2 split across the jury that he was guilty on all counts of murder and attempted murder, and he went to prison for the rest of his life and eventually died in 2018 of medical complications. I believe something to do with an aneurysm in the stomach, something along those lines. But he is now deceased, and he was in the place he should have always been, in prison. Now, the documentary, very good documentary, fascinating to hear some of his memoirs, some of his points of view, and more importantly, the points of view of the people that were involved at the time, you know, whether it be the families of the victims, his mother, or the detectives and people like that. And one thing that was a real standout was his relationship with his grandfather, because apparently his grandfather took him everywhere. He was very young. He was, you know, up to the age of 5 years old, I think, is when his grandfather passed away. And he felt very loved by his grandfather. He felt like his grandfather always took him anywhere, you know, where his grandfather went. And his grandfather died when he was 5 and he had an open casket. And apparently Des has gone on to say that seeing his grandfather there, someone that he loved, dead, seeing his dead body at 5 years old, in his mind, that is when love and death fused. So don't take a child to an open casket funeral. And also, he later came out and claimed that his grandfather actually molested him as a young child. So there are a few factors there that could have contributed to the outcome that is Des Nilsen. The documentary goes into, it's more about why did he do what he did. And there's a guy that I think wrote a lot of things about him and received all of these tapes and memoirs from him. And he derives that this is nature, not nurture. You know, he was just an evil person. You know, it wasn't how society treated him as a gay man and how he felt oppressed. It wasn't because his grandfather may or may not have molested him, and it wasn't because he, you know, saw his grandfather dead at the age of 5, and that's where it solidified this fascination with corpses. This guy in the documentary kind of disregards all that, but it's fascinating, and I think ultimately we'll never know, and it's down to personal interpretation. And I would love to know what you guys think. What do you think was the motivation behind such a clearly evil man? I would love to know. So thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this. A bit longer, this one. I thought I'd go into a little bit more detail on the case. I highly recommend those tapes on Netflix right now. It's 1 hour and 20, but it's 1 hour and 20 of time that I don't think you'll regret spending. It's very well written, it's very well portrayed, it's very well shot. It's just a really good documentary, a solid Netflix documentary. That's it for me, guys. Like, share and subscribe. Thank you so much. I will see you very soon. Sweet one, geese.